We belong together like avocado and literally everything.
Welcome to episode 5 on His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama. So, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, Dr. Lin of Stanford received his doctorate in philosophy of history, DPhil in history at Oxford. I just looked it up in 2003. Then he got his book published in 2006 on Tibet and nationalist China's frontier. Vigorous action taken by the Manchus from 1908 to 1911 in the Tibetan Kham area in the eastern area bordering Sichuan partially counteracted British India's growing influence in Tibetan affairs. Attempts were made by the ailing Qing court to incorporate Kham under its firm control, including insisting that all inhabitants of the Kham area were subjects of the Manchu emperor and subject to the jurisdiction of a Qing-appointed magistrate, that all taxes were to be paid to the central government, that traditional taxes paid to the Khampa or Tibetan native chiefs and monasteries were to be abolished, and that all inhabitants were to be subject to Chinese law. These reform programs greatly infuriated the 13th Dalai Lama, who afterward fled to India, where he was warmly received by the British. According to Dr. Parshotam Mehta in his book, the Dalai Lama's return to the Potala sometime in December 1909 after his long wanderings in Mongolia and Beijing and Wutaishan proved to be no better than a breathing spell. In actual fact, he spent less than 50 days in Lhasa. The people sent by the Qing Empire followed him close on his heels as he fled from the Potala early in February 1910, almost with a price on his head. Instead of plowing over again through the barren wastes of Nagchukka and the Changtang, the Lama now took a southerly direction and, crossing over into India, sought refuge from his former foes. Despite his ill-disguised overtures and clear anxiety, he offered the Indian Governor-General a virtual protectorate over his land and people. Any possibility of the British coming to his aid in his unequal struggle with the Chinese was categorically ruled out in Whitehall. Mercifully, the years of the Lama's exile from 1910 to 1912 in South Asia were witness to a mighty cataclysm in the fortunes of the Qing dynasty, which in its wake brought about a complete collapse of Chinese authority in Tibet, and thereby helped to restore the Dalai Lama to his former throne. Paradoxically, even during these difficult days, there was no end to the internecine rivalry between the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. Thus, it had been widely believed that the Chinese have denounced and dethroned the Dalai Lama a second time, found themselves in a mess from which they hoped the Panchen would extricate them by occupying the Potala and taking the Dalai Lama's place. There's evidence to suggest that the Panchen Lama almost, but not quite, played into Chinese hands. In 1910, he repaired to Lhasa, but in the end shrank from falling over the precipice. Footnote 32. 3 specific charges are leveled. 1. In establishing a political relationship with Anban Lianyu, thereby breaking traditional rules, the Panchen Lama had shown an intent to assume power. 2. In 1911, when the Dalai Lama had ordered strong action against the Chinese garrisons occupying Lhasa, the Panchen Lama's followers and other disgruntled monks of the Tengyeling monastery in Lhasa paid little attention. 3. That the Panchen's association with the Chinese Anban and his inaction in face of virtual Chinese occupation in 1910 to 1911 showed collusion, if not collaboration. Again, at the behest of the Chinese, he wrote to the Lama to return to Tibet, but carefully balanced the written missive by an oral message, advising the Dalai Lama not to return to Tibet unless his safety was guaranteed by British government, and explaining that his letter had been written under pressure from the Chinese. Despite his ostensible concern for the safety and welfare of the Dalai Lama, at heart the Panchen Lama had been uneasy both during the Dalai Lama's long wanderings in Mongolia and later China, and his second exile in India. On both occasions, he had confided in the British his growing sense of anxiety and concern as to what fortunes awaited him should the Dalai Lama return in high dudgeon. While there is no knowing as to what transpired at Nakchu Ka in October-November 1909, when the two lamas had conferred, it is clear that the quiet diplomacy of the British played a significant role in arranging a meeting between the Dalai and the Panchen at Ralung, not far from Gyansa, in July 1912. For earlier, the Dalai gave directions to Jyashree Lama in course of communication with him by telephone to meet him at Ralung on the 16th, and added an assurance that no apprehension as to future need be felt by Jyashree Lama, aka the Panchen Lama, or his officials. The British man who conceived the idea of persuading the Panchen Lama to leave his retreat at Jyashree Lumpur was Frederick O'Connor, who, appointed trade agent at Gyansa on young husband's return from Lhasa, had visited the Lama at his monastery as part of the expedition to western Tibet led by Captain Rawling. Briefly and in the short run, O'Connor argued the British should help the Lama assert his independence of the Dalai Lama's control, and thereby to an extent fill in the political vacuum which filled by Peking. In the long run, O'Connor was much more ambitious, for while seizing the present favorable opportunity of cementing Britain's friendship with the Panchen, even going so far, if necessary, as to subsidize and protect him, he would, quote, open under the terms of the Lhasa Convention a new trade mart at Shikatsa, and to let it be clearly understood that any intrigues of other powers at Lhasa would be met by a corresponding extension of our influence in the province of Tsang and southern Tibet. And all this might be done without openly impugning or infringing Chinese suzerainty. So they were already thinking about partitioning Tibet, separating so-called inner Uzang Tibet from Kham as early as the 1906, 07, 08 period, according to this book by Dr. Mehta. Perhaps due to his background, he's very familiar with the British sources and the colonial intrigues. However, he has the tendency of focusing too much on personality dramas. One can often forget there is a larger systematic Asia versus Europe scenario going on, as well as the tremendous transition from an imperial dynastic system to modern nationhood experienced by the majority of people living in China/borderlands of Tibet. O'Connor proposed inviting the Panchen to pay a ceremonial visit to India to meet the Prince of Wales and attend the Durbar to be held on the occasion at Calcutta. But a condition precedent to the Lama's visit, the British agent argued, was that Calcutta should guarantee to protect him against possible combined wrath of both the Dalai Lama and the Chinese. Without such a guarantee, it may not be easy to persuade the Lama to leave his monastery. More in its absence, it would be less than fair to ask him to compromise himself with us in such a marked manner. White forwarded O'Connor's proposal to Calcutta, recommending that an invitation be extended without stating explicitly the attendant undertaking to which the trade agent had drawn his pointed attention. The Viceroy's formal invitation was received in September, and 2 months later O'Connor finally persuaded a seemingly reluctant, half-hearted, if timid Panchen to accept it on the clear understanding that it involves a promise of help from us against any attempted retaliation on the part of the Lhasa government. For the Panchen, with a large escort and in full regalia, had already left Shikatsa on his way to Calcutta. Here, meanwhile, a complete transformation had come over the administration with the departure of Lord Curzon on November 17, 1905, and the assumption of office by Lord Minto, a change further accentuated when, a few weeks later, the rickety Tory government of Arthur Balfour gave place to the Liberals under Asquith. In Calcutta, when the Panchen sought his promised assurances from the mouth of the Viceroy himself, the latter found it hard to return any honest, much less categorical replies. Determined to dissociate himself completely from all that Curzon had stood for, and with the new political orientation in Whitehall, this appeared best. Minto understandably did not like the idea of any attack on the Lama, either by the Chinese or the Lhasa authorities. This clearly implied that the Panchan's much sought for military help from the British was uncalled for. To the Lama's further plea that the trade agent at Gyansa should be kept in the closest possible contact with him so that in an emergency he could communicate directly with the Governor General through a special messenger, Minto returned an equally vague, if non-committal, answer. Not long after the fanfare of the Durbar and the usual junket to the Buddha's holy places, the Lama returned to his monastery wiser, if sadder, for his experience. Panchan's visit, its aftermath. The empty-handed return of the Panchan marked the end of O'Connor's brilliant, albeit short-lived, foray to save what he could of the shambles of Curzon's Tibetan policy. So that was the British drama and intrigue in Tibet. Now back to the Chinese side. The outbreak of the Chinese Revolution in 1911 terminated the Manchu effort to implement a series of state-building programs in Tibet. In 1912, the 13th Dalai Lama restored his power in Tibet with the strong support of the British government of India, while Chinese central influence was almost entirely ousted from this territory. So a lot of the troops just went to India, and some people even stayed there and never went back to China. In Peking, the Chinese Republican government
And
was
then Dr.
too
Lin
preoccupied
goes
with
on
its
to
internal
discuss
problems to
the
exercise
Shimla
substantial
Accords,
control
which
over
was
Tibet.
a conference between the Chinese nationalist government and representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as well as the British, in British colonial India. In Himachal Pradesh, today, you can still find the Shimla Church. For today's episode, I will end here, and if you guys are interested, you can look up Mr. Tenzin Tunde's interview online, which he completed this year with a fellow Indian interlocutor, and he does a very good job of dissecting the Shimla Accords from a Tibetan activist perspective. Thanks for listening, and take care.